The burlap sacks were heavy, their coarse weave digging into her shoulders, and the path from the creek bed was a treacherous slope of loose shale. Agnes made the trip 4 times a day, hauling dark, rich soil from the water's edge up to the gaping mouth in the rock face. It was a wound in the hillside, a place the townsfolk called the Scab, an inheritance from her late husband Daniel that had come with a deed, a half-built cabin in the valley below, and the pitying looks of her neighbors. The cabin she had sold for supplies. The pity she ignored. The Scab was all she cared about. Inside, the air was cool and still, smelling of damp stone and a deep, ancient quiet. A dozen lanterns, hung from pegs driven into fissures in the rock, cast a steady, golden light over the strange farm she was building in the belly of the earth. Alastair Finch found her there on a Tuesday, his shadow falling long and sharp across the entrance just as she hauled another sack over the threshold. He was a man whose wealth had settled into his posture, making him seem taller and broader than he was. He owned the largest ranch in the county, a sprawling testament to his belief that a man could tame any piece of land he put his mind to. He looked from her sweat-streaked face to the mounds of dark soil arranged in neat, long beds deep within the cave. "Agnes," he said, his voice a mix of amusement and disbelief. He didn't offer to help with the sack she lowered to the ground with a grunt. "I heard the talk in town, but I confess I thought it was exaggeration. A farm in a rock." Agnes straightened, wiping her brow with the back of a dusty glove. She did not offer him a greeting. "It's not a rock, Mr. Finch. It's a cave." A distinction without a difference, he chuckled, stepping inside but staying near the light of the entrance, as if the darkness further in might soil his polished boots. "The sun doesn't shine in here. What do you expect to grow? More moss?" His eyes scanned the meticulous rows of turned earth, the carefully constructed wooden frames of the beds, the channels she had dug to guide the trickle of water seeping from a high seam in the stone. It was an absurdity, a monumental waste of a widow's dwindling time and energy. "You'd have been better off keeping the cabin. At least it had a proper field." "The field is exposed," Agnes said, her voice flat and even. She picked up her spade. "The soil here is mine to command. The light is mine to provide. The weather cannot touch it." Finch laughed then, a full, booming sound that echoed unnervingly in the enclosed space. "The weather? Good woman, it's September. The sky is as clear as a promise. We'll have a mild winter, the almanac says so." "You're burying yourself alive based on what?" "A bad dream." She plunged the spade into a fresh pile of soil, the scrape of metal on grit the only answer for a long moment. She thought of Daniel, of his hands growing cold in hers, of the sky that had turned from blue to a blinding, killing white in the space of an afternoon. A bad dream was a gentle word for it. It was a memory branded into her soul. Finally, she looked at him, her eyes clear and steady. "I don't trust promises, Mr. Finch. Not from the sky, and not from a book." His laughter faded into a patronizing smile. He shook his head, a gesture of a man confirming a sad but expected diagnosis. "As you wish, Agnes. But don't come to me when you're out of lamp oil and chewing on dusty roots. A person can't hide from the world. It's a sign of a weak spirit." He turned and walked away, his confident stride taking him back into the brilliant, deceitful sunshine, leaving her alone in the quiet, growing dark of her sanctuary. The laughter meant nothing. The pity meant nothing. They were noises from a world that had not seen what she had seen. The world Finch lived in was one of surface and assumption, of clear skies and predictable seasons. Her world was governed by the memory of a single afternoon 5 years prior, an afternoon that had stolen the sun and her husband with it. Daniel had been a man much like Finch, full of confidence in the land and his own strength. He'd believed in the almanac, too. He'd laughed when she'd suggested they bring in the last of the firewood from the far ridge before the end of the month. "Elspeth, my love," he had called her then, using her given name, "there's a week of good weather yet. Look at that sky." The sky had been a vast, cloudless blue. The air was crisp but warm. They were new to the territory, their cabin barely finished, their confidence high. The blizzard that came was not a storm, it was an ambush. It fell out of that clear sky like a collapsing wall, a tide of white that erased the horizon, the trees, and then the path back to the cabin. Daniel had been caught on the ridge. He had tried to make it back. She'd found him the next morning, not 50 yards from the door, a frozen statue curled beneath a drift that had, overnight, become as hard as iron. The cold had not just taken his life, it had taken the warmth from the world itself, leaving Agnes with a permanent chill in her bones and a vow whispered into the unfeeling wind. Never again. Never again would she be unprepared. Never again would she trust a clear sky. After selling the cabin, she had walked the land Daniel had left her for weeks, not looking for a place to live, but for a place to survive. The scab, as the locals called it, was an ugly, useless feature to them. A dark mouth on a sun-scorched hill. But when Agnes stepped inside, she felt not dread, but potential. The temperature was constant. The wind could not find her. The deep, resonant silence was a balm. Here, the world could rage, and she would be untouched. It was a fortress built by nature, waiting for a garrison. Her grief was not a weakness, it was a blueprint. Every memory of Daniel's frozen face, every recollection of her own gnawing hunger as she waited for the thaw, became a line in that blueprint. The farm inside the cave was not an act of fear. It was an act of defiance. It was a memorial built not of stone, but of life, of resilience, of a promise being kept to a man who could no longer hear it. She would build a world that the winter could not kill. The work was brutal, a relentless cycle of hauling, digging, and building. First, she'd constructed the living space, a small, sturdy cabin of pine and cedar tucked into the deepest, driest part of the cave. It wasn't large, just a single room with a bed, a small stove, and shelves hammered directly into the rock walls, but it was a bastion of warmth and order against the cavern's raw stone. The chimney pipe snaked up through a natural fissure in the ceiling, a narrow crack she had painstakingly widened with a hammer and chisel over the course of a month, until it provided a safe vent for the smoke. The scent of burning hickory soon mingled with the smell of damp earth, a human scent in a geological place. Then came the farm. She built the long, raised garden beds out of rough-hewn planks, lining them with pebbles for drainage before filling them with the rich, black soil from the creek. They were her fields, her acres, contained and controllable. Above them, she hung the lanterns, a constellation of artificial suns. She knew they couldn't replicate the full power of daylight, but she wasn't trying to grow summer squash or corn. She planted what could survive, even thrive, in lower light, thick-rooted carrots, hardy lettuces, kale, and rows of potatoes that grew happily in the deep, loose soil. She learned the rhythms of her self-contained world. She would spend hours tending the plants, moving the lanterns to ensure even coverage, her hands constantly in the cool, life-giving dirt. She talked to them, her voice a low murmur that was swallowed by the immense quiet. They were her companions, a silent testament to her stubborn will. The town continued to talk. Her project was a source of endless speculation and amusement. The women whispered that grief had unhinged her. The men, like Finch, saw it as a fool's errand, an affront to the proper way of doing things. You farmed under the sun. You lived in a house with windows. You respected the seasons, you didn't try to build a fortress against them. Her refusal to engage, her quiet, steady focus, only fueled their stories. She was the mad widow of the scab, a woman digging her own grave. She heard the whispers when she made her weekly trip to the general store for salt, oil, and other necessities she couldn't produce herself. She saw the way they watched her, their eyes full of a strange mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She bought what she needed, answered no questions, and returned to her cave, the heavy wooden door she'd built shutting out their world and sealing her within her own. Her solitude was a shield, her work a prayer, and every carrot that sprouted, every potato she unearthed, was a small, silent victory. The final element of her plan was the most difficult. She used the last of her money to purchase a young milk cow and 4 laying hens. Leading the cow up the rocky path and into the mouth of the cave was an ordeal that left her exhausted and bruised, but the animal, once inside, seemed to calm in the steady coolness. Agnes had prepared a pen for it at the far end of the cavern, near a deep pool of clear, cold water that seeped up from the ground. The floor was covered in a thick layer of straw, which she would muck out and use as fertilizer for her gardens. The chickens were easier, content in a small coop she'd built against the cabin wall. Their soft clucking and the cow's occasional lowing brought a new dimension of life to the cave. It was no longer just a shelter, it was a homestead. The smell of livestock mingled with the scents of soil and smoke. The daily routine of milking the cow, collecting the warm brown eggs, and turning the compost became her new calendar, a rhythm independent of the sun and moon. This development, when it became known, cemented her reputation as an eccentric. Alastair Finch held court at the mercantile, his voice dripping with condescension. "She has animals in there now," he announced to the men gathered around the stove. "A cow that has never tasted fresh grass, chickens that will never scratch in the sun. It's unnatural. Mark my words, no good will come of it. That cave will be a tomb of disease and madness by the time the first real snow flies." The men nodded in agreement. It was easier to agree with a man like Finch. His success was visible, written across the valley in herds of cattle and miles of fencing. Her work was hidden, strange, a thing of rumor and shadow. They chose the world they could see over the one they could not imagine. Agnes, meanwhile, ignored them. She was storing wealth they couldn't comprehend. Every bucket of milk was cooled in the deep pool. Every egg was a perfect protein. Every shovelful of manure was future fertility for her gardens. She was building a closed, sustainable system, a tiny, living world immune to the whims of the sky. While they trusted the sun, she was trusting the earth beneath her feet. The change came subtly at first. It began not with a storm, but with an unnatural stillness. The boisterous chorus of insects that had filled the late summer nights fell silent weeks earlier than usual. The birds, too, seemed to vanish overnight, their migratory urge triggered by a signal imperceptible to the townspeople. A peculiar quality entered the light, the brilliant, hard-edged sun of the high plains softened into a hazy, yellow glare, as if shining through a film. The air, which should have been crisp and dry, felt heavy, carrying a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. Agnes felt it in her joints, an old ache that echoed the memory of that last, fatal winter. She watched the sky from the mouth of her cave, her face impassive but her senses on high alert. This was how it had begun before. A beautiful, silent wrongness. Her work took on a new urgency. She harvested the last of her potatoes, burying them in deep, straw-lined crates. The carrots were pulled and stored in sand. She spent 2 full days chopping the last of the wood she had gathered, stacking it high against the inner wall of her cabin. She checked the seals on the heavy door, packing the gaps with strips of wool. Inside the cave, life went on in its steady, lantern-lit rhythm. The cow chewed its cud, its warm breath misting in the cool air. The chickens pecked at their feed. The green shoots of her winter lettuce were pushing through the dark soil. To an outsider, it was a scene of bizarre, subterranean domesticity. To Agnes, it was the final locking of the gate against an approaching army. Down in the town, Alastair Finch was hosting a harvest supper. He stood on his porch and dismissed the signs that Agnes was reading so carefully. A quick cold snap, nothing more, he declared to his guests, his voice full of the easy confidence of a man who had never been truly tested. "Builds character in the livestock. We'll have a mild season. The almanac has never failed me." His words were a comfort to the others. They wanted to believe him. They wanted to believe in the predictability of their world, in the strength of their homes, in the certainty that their preparations, a cord of wood, a side of bacon, a few sacks of flour, were enough. They ate and drank and laughed, while high above them, in the dark mouth of the scab, a lone woman watched the sky and waited for the promise to be broken. The first snow began not as flakes, but as a fine, granular powder, almost like sand, driven on a wind that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It didn't drift down, it scoured the landscape, hissing as it flew. Within an hour, the world beyond the cave mouth was gone, replaced by a churning, vertical river of white. Agnes stood just inside the entrance, watching the blizzard consume the valley. The sound was the first shock, a low, guttural moan that grew into a deafening, inhuman shriek. It was a physical presence, a pressure that made the stone of the cave itself seem to vibrate. She felt no fear, only a grim, quiet vindication. It had come, just as she knew it would. She pulled the heavy wooden door shut, dropped the thick crossbar into its brackets, and the world of wind and ice vanished. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the soft lowing of her cow and the gentle hiss of the lanterns. Her world was now complete, an island of calm in a sea of fury. Down in the valley, the town hunkered down. At first, there was a sense of communal novelty. Fires were lit, stories were told. This was a hardship, yes, but a familiar one. It was part of life on the plains. But the storm did not behave as other storms had. It did not blow itself out in a day or two. The wind never ceased its assault, and the snow kept falling, an endless supply being dumped from a steel-gray sky that never lightened. Fences disappeared. Then wood piles. Then the snow began to creep up the walls of the houses, covering the windows one by one, plunging the homes into a dim, perpetual twilight. The cold was a living entity. It forced its way through chinks in the walls, under doors, through the very fabric of the buildings. Wood that should have lasted a month was gone in a week, burnt at a frantic pace just to keep the frost from forming on the inside of the walls. Alastair Finch's grand house, built on a rise to command a view of his lands, was now his greatest vulnerability. The wind hit it from all sides, a battering ram that never tired. The vast, single-pane windows he had been so proud of became sheets of ice, radiating a mortal cold into every room. His bravado from the harvest supper was a distant memory, frozen and shattered. His cattle, isolated in the large, drafty barn, began to die, their frozen bodies a testament to a confidence that nature had decided to punish. The town was no longer a community, it was a collection of isolated, freezing prisons, each household fighting a losing battle against a relentless, impartial enemy. The third day became the fifth. The fifth became the 10th. The blizzard did not stop. It layered, one storm burying the evidence of the one before it under ever deeper drifts. The world was reduced to the shriek of the wind and the suffocating weight of the snow. Hope began to curdle into a quiet, desperate dread. Food was now being rationed. The last of the firewood was being burned. Families huddled together in a single room, wrapped in every blanket they owned, listening to the storm try to tear their homes apart. The initial confidence was long gone, replaced by the grim mathematics of survival. How many days until the food ran out? How many hours until the last piece of wood was gone and the killing cold could finally come inside? For Alastair Finch, the breaking point came on the 12th day. The last of his cattle were dead. The roof of his barn had collapsed under a weight of snow so immense it had splintered the main beam. Inside his house, the temperature was now well below freezing. He and his wife had burned furniture to stay alive, but now only the grand dining table remained. His supplies, so plentiful for a normal winter, were nearly gone, consumed by the need for constant calories to fight the cold. His arrogance had been stripped away layer by layer, scoured from him by the wind, leaving only the raw, terrified core of a man facing his own mortality. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the air, that they would not survive another week. And in the depths of his despair, a single, humiliating image rose in his mind, the mad widow, hauling sacks of dirt into a cave. The woman he had mocked. The fool he had pitied. She was their only chance. The journey was an act of near-suicidal desperation. It took him 3 hours to cross the few hundred yards from his house to the path leading up to the scab. He moved through a landscape of monstrous white shapes, the snow so deep he was often wading up to his chest. The wind tore at him, stealing his breath and freezing the moisture in his beard into a mask of ice. He was no longer the proud rancher, the master of the valley. He was just a small, freezing creature, a speck of life in a universe of white hostility. When he finally reached the rock face, he could barely see the outline of the heavy wooden door through the swirling snow. He fell against it, his gloved hands beating a weak, frantic rhythm. It was a sound that should have been swallowed by the storm, but somehow, it was heard. The crossbar scraped, and the door swung inward, revealing a pocket of impossible warmth and golden light. Agnes stood there, holding a lantern. She was not surprised. She looked at the man before her, a husk of the proud figure who had mocked her just weeks ago. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild with desperation and shame. He tried to speak, but his throat was a raw, frozen knot. He could only stare past her into the scene within the cave. He saw the small, sturdy cabin, a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. He saw the neat rows of green letters growing under the steady light of a dozen lanterns. He smelled the rich, living scent of damp earth, warm animals, and cooking food. He heard the impossible sound of a cow lowing contentedly in the deep, unassailable quiet. It was another world, a bubble of life carved into the heart of a dead one. "Mr. Finch," Agnes said, her voice calm and even. There was no triumph in it, no hint of accusation. He finally found his voice, a ragged whisper. "Agnes. We were wrong." He didn't ask for help for himself. The pride was gone, but the responsibility remained. There are others. The millers have nothing left. The baker's wife is ill. We are freezing. We are starving. He finally met her eyes, and in them, he saw not the madness he had once diagnosed, but a profound and unshakable strength. He had built his kingdom on the surface of the world, and the world had taken it away. She had built hers in the heart of the rock, and it had endured. "Can you help us?" he asked, the question a complete surrender of everything he had ever believed himself to be. Agnes did not answer with words. She simply stepped back, holding the lantern higher to light his way in. There was no hesitation, no demand for an apology. The reality of the situation was apology enough. The proof of her wisdom was all around them, in the soft clucking of the hens, in the verdant green of her impossible garden, in the steady, life-giving warmth that emanated from her small stove. She led him to her cabin and sat him by the fire, handing him a mug of warm milk. It was the richest thing he had ever tasted. While he drank, she moved with quiet efficiency, packing a burlap sack with carrots, potatoes, and a dozen eggs carefully wrapped in straw. She filled a sealed pail with milk from a larger container cooling in the deep pool. She did not speak of his mockery, nor of her own vindication. The storm screaming outside was all the commentary that was needed. Her actions were the only sermon she would ever give. She was not saving a man who had scorned her, she was helping a neighbor who was in need. Her preparedness had been born of personal grief, a private monument to a devastating loss. But in this moment, it was transformed into a public grace. It was no longer just about her own survival. It was about the survival of the very community that had dismissed her. When the sack was full, she helped him secure it to his back. "The path is drifted over," she said, her first full sentence to him. "Follow the rock face to the left. There is a ledge there, the wind keeps it clearer." It was practical advice, a gift of knowledge earned through observation. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it left no room for words. He simply nodded, turned, and stepped back out into the maelstrom, a man carrying not just food, but the humbling weight of a lesson he would never forget. The great blizzard broke after 19 days. The wind finally died, and the sun returned to a world that was utterly transformed. It was a landscape of profound silence and blinding white, the familiar contours of the valley buried under a deep, sculptural shroud. The survivors emerged slowly, blinking in the bright light, their faces etched with hardship and loss. The town had been decimated, but it had not been extinguished. The food from Agnes's cave, distributed by a humbled and tireless Alastair Finch, had been just enough to bridge the gap between desperation and survival for several families. The story of his journey to the scab, and of her quiet, immediate generosity, spread through the valley as the thaw began. No one ever called her the Mad Widow again. Alastair Finch, a changed man, led the effort to rebuild. But he did so with a new kind of authority, one born of humility, not of wealth. He organized work crews to clear paths and check on the isolated homesteads. And he was the first to go to Agnes, not for a handout, but for advice. He asked her about the signs she had seen, about the way the light had changed, about the silence of the insects. He listened, truly listened, as she spoke of Daniel's almanac and the lie of a clear blue sky. The cave, once Agnes's folly, became a place of pilgrimage. The townsfolk would come, one by one, to see the impossible farm. They saw the ingenuity of the gardens, the simple wisdom of the livestock pens, the security of the deep, stone walls. They saw that what they had mistaken for madness was in fact a profound and hard-won sanity. Agnes never gloated. She simply shared what she knew, explaining how to read the subtler signs of the seasons, how to preserve food, how to build for a world that was not always kind. Her private memorial to her lost husband had become the town's textbook for the future. She had built a fortress to keep the world out, only to discover that its true purpose was to let the world back in, changed and ready to learn.